Only the ALDMERI, the High Elves and their noble allies, the Wood Elves and Catmen, have the wisdom and restraint to peaceably rule the disparate peoples of Tamriel. Though we are reluctant to take up this burden, events have shown us that we must. Men always follow the destructive path of their defender and apologist, the missing god whom we shall not name. This ends here. Once again, elves shall rule Tamriel from the White Gold Tower, this time forever. The ALDMERI Dominion, founded by the ALDMERI Queen Ayren of Alinor, was formed with one key purpose in mind: to conquer Tamriel, to free the Heartland from the human usurpers, who'd been emboldened by the insolence of their slave queen Alicia. And so it read in the Dominion's propaganda: they would ensure for the good of all who dwell in Nirn that men never again tamper with forces beyond their comprehension and competence. This elven alliance between the High Elves of Somerset, the Wood Elves of Valenwood, and the Catfolk of Elsewhere began in the 580th year of the Second Era, during the reign of Empress Regent Clivia Tharn. Despite the vigorous sentiments of the Dominion at the time, we know that the Empire did not fall. Yes, it suffered bouts of seemingly fatal instability, but as of the present day, men continue to rule the Heartland. With such a simplified view of Tamriel's history, one could conclude that the Empire were therefore superior, and the High Elves would have to settle for their isolated island of Somerset in the southwest. But history is rarely this simple, and the relationship between the Empire and the Dominion is one that requires much more analysis. Men and Mer have a turbulent past, and thousands of years of bitter rivalry is on the verge of reaching its climax in the present day. And so, there is no better time to ask this question: who should rule Tamriel? Who will win? What is up, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Scott and welcome back to FudgeMuppet. Today we have a colossal beast of a topic to discuss. As is always the case with mortal politics, I'd have an easier time explaining the cosmos and the meaning of life in the Elder Scrolls than I would trying to determine which of these factions is superior. Nevertheless, in this video we're going to do our best to get to the bottom of this epoch-spanning animosity found between men and elves. This video is the Empire versus the Dominion. But in order to properly determine the victor, we must explore the histories of both factions, as well as the history of the races involved. We must not only ask who would win in an all-out war, but who would be more fit to rule Tamriel, and who would more effectively govern a continent inhabited by various diverse cultures. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's get right into it. All Tamrielic religions begin the same. Man or Mer, things begin with the dualism of Anu and his other. The schism in the human ALDMERI worldview is the mortal's relationship to the divine. Humans take the humble path that they were created by the immortal forces, while the Aldmer claim descent from them. It doesn't seem like much, but it's a distinction that colors the rest of their diverging mythologies. So if you were wondering where the conflict between man and elf began, here is your answer. They have been staunchly opposed to one another since their very creation. Their perceptions of the gods are at odds with one another, and as a result, a deity revered by one culture can be despised by the other. Lorcan, the missing god, or the trickster god, is venerated by men despite him deceiving the other Aedra, for without his deception the mortal realm, and therefore the mortals themselves, would not exist. This same god is abhorred by the elves, for he trapped the Mer in their mortal forms, weakening them from their once divine origins. Such divergences in dogma could not be overlooked easily, and so began a long history of racial tension. To make matters worse, circumstances naturally put men and elves at odds. Further along the nebulous early timeline of Mundus in the Merethic era, the elves made their migration to Tamriel from the distant continent of Aldmeris. At first, most, if not all, of the early Aldmer settled on the Somerset Isles. But this rather small melting pot proved too constraining for the rising social tensions between elven subsets. A series of emigrations followed as different groups of Aldmer spread across Tamriel. The superiority complex of the elves seems to be somewhat innate, but it was certainly emphasized by their superiority and intellectual and technological innovations. Compared to the Nedic and Beast natives of mainland Tamriel, the elves were undoubtedly more advanced, and soon enough, non-elf races were being subjugated and enslaved. Perhaps the most egregious case of elven slave labor came in the heartland of Cirid. The Aelid elves expended no effort providing basic mortal rights to the natives and abused the needs with frightening efficiency. Of course, this video is about the ALDMERI Dominion and their High Elf leadership, not the Heartland Aelid elves. But do you think the humans cared for this minor distinction? The Aelids and the Ultima are cut from the same cloth, and with the exception of their societal and cultural differences, about the only way to distinguish between the two races is identifying the very slight tan of Aelid skin. Unsurprisingly, hatred for their elven masters burgeoned fast, as the slavers grew complacent and normalizing more and more forms of oppression. A response from the humans was inevitable. One way this resentment took shape was the rise of the legendary warrior named Pelinore Whitestrake. This is one of the more mysterious characters in the Elder Scrolls history, as his story reads more like the deeds of a god than a man. He wandered Tamriel in the late Merethic era, building kingdoms from the ground up before abandoning them to wander again. Many men believed Pelinore was an avatar sent by Shazar, the missing god, to serve as the champion for all mankind. The Song of Pelinore calls him the Scourge of the Elves. The second way this resentment took shape was in Saint Alicia, who was the catalyst for the Elysian slave rebellion. Under her leadership and the assistance of Morehouse, the Man-Bull, the Nedic slaves rose up against their Aelid oppressors, and with the aid of Pelinore Whitestrake, the Aelids were about to witness their retribution. And he walked into the jungles of Cirid, already killing. Morehouse stamped at his side, froth-bloody and bellowing from excitement because the Pelinore was come. And Pelinore came to Perif's camp of rebels holding a sword and mace, both encrusted with the smashed viscera of elven faces, feathers and magic beads, which were the markings of the Aeladun, stuck to the redness that hung from his weapons, and he lifted them, saying, "These were their eastern chieftains, no longer full of their talking." Pelinore's bloody battle against the Aelids culminated in his battle with the Aelid sorcerer king, Umaril the Unfeathered. Pelinore defeated Umaril. Umaril was laid low, the angel face of his helm dented into the ugliness which made Pelinore laugh, and his unfeathered wings broke off with sword strokes delivered while Pelinore stood above him, insulting his ancestry and anyone else that took ship from old Elnafey. Despite being cut down by the remaining Aelid kings, Umaril's defeat was enough to grant Morehouse victory when he marched his army into the citadel. It was the 243rd year of the First Era when the White Gold Tower was officially captured by the Elysians. The surviving Aelids were refugees, most of whom fled to Valenwood, Somerset and the Isle of Balfiera. Alicia declared herself the first empress of the new Cyrodiilic Empire. The humans united under Alicia's banner became known fittingly as the Imperials, and the long legacy of imperial empires, despite many highs and lows, would endure until the present day. We know that Queen Irene founded the ALDMERI Dominion with the intention of bringing Cyrodiil back under elven control, and we also know that the Empire was founded with the goal of removing the elven overlords from Cyrodiil. The stage was set for a bitter rivalry. So the Empire of Cyrodiil predates the ALDMERI Dominion by over 3,000 years. That's a considerable amount of time for the Imperials to master the arts of governance and diplomacy. No wonder their race has a reputation for shrewdness. Alicia's empire was built on the foundations of a covenant with the dragon god of time, Akatosh. With the creation of the Amulet of Kings and the Dragonfires, the Imperials were promised protection from the Daedric hordes of Oblivion. Thus began a legacy of the Dragonblood heirs. When Alicia passed, her son Balatza the Man-Bull took over as the new emperor. Little is known of these early days, but it seems reasonable to assume that Balatza, who was one of the first Minotaurs, clashed with some of the more xenophobic members of the emerging Elysian Order, a religious sect which rose to prominence in the early days of the Empire. The next known emperor, Gorius, faced much opposition from both the Nords of Skyrim, led by High King Hjorek the White, and King Rislav Larek of Skingrad, who defeated the emperor and drastically weakened the Elysian Empire. It would seem the early days of Cyrodiil's Empire of Men were not as peaceful as the slave rebels would have initially hoped. The next known emperor, or should I say empress, was named Hestra, and she reigned early in the second millennium of the First Era. This means there's an almost 600-year blind spot in the early records. Either way, Hestra's rule was no less arduous than Gorius's. Though Hestra was met with much more success in her warmongering, she managed to bring High Rock under imperial control around the 1029th year of the First Era. Then, she expunged the epidemic of pirates and brigands plaguing the swamplands of Blackmarsh. She also brought the wild savages of the Reach under her heal. Hestra is also credited with improving the road systems of her empire. It would seem that over the centuries, the Imperials have learned not only to organize themselves and free their kind from elven oppressors, they've also learned how to expand their borders, rooting out revolts wherever they sprouted. I would like to take this opportunity to comment on the current state of affairs for the Ultima, but it would seem that they've had scarce little to do over the years. While everything was happening on the mainland, the Ultima of Somerset were isolated from the rest of the world. The etheric ocean served as a moat, defending them from all troubles of Tamriel. According to the Pocket Guide to the Empire, the rise and fall of empires, the battles between man and Mer, none of these touched the Ultima as a society. Internal conflicts between Skywatch and Firsthold, and between Alinor and Lilandril often sparked into full war, but far deadlier were the repeated attempts at invasion from the alien lands of Thras and Pyandania. Though the Sloat of Thras never succeeded in reclaiming Somerset, if that was their goal, they visited horrors upon the land. And as for the Marima Sea Elves, the chronicler can scarcely find a year throughout the First and Second eras where the Marima did not ravage the coastlines of the Ultima. As terrible as it was, it did force the Ultima to build a great navy to defend itself, and to this day, it is on the seas that the High Elves excel in combat. There are villages in the central valleys of Somerset that have never seen battle, but so much blood has been spilled along the coasts. It is a wonder that it is not stained permanently crimson. The High Elves may not have as much experience as the Imperials ruling empires and managing foreign relations during the First Era, but they most certainly were learning to be a formidable force in battle. No amount of besieging from their neighbours over thousands of years was enough to defeat them, and it's hard to blame the Ultima for their isolationist attitude. Back in Cyrodiil, the final days of the Elysian Empire were upon the Imperials. It was the 2321st year of the First Era, and internal strife among the Elysian priesthood prompted the Clovian kings of the West to sever ties with the Empire, establishing their own government called the Colovian Estates. War eventually broke out, and the Elysian Empire collapsed completely over the next decade. The Empire was no more until the rise of Reman Cyrodiil almost 400 years later. Reman's reign would be the beginning of the first dynasty of the Second Empire. Unlike the Elysian Empire, the Second Empire would conquer much more than High Rock and the Reach. Reman's dynasty began with a glorious victory over the invading Akaviri forces in year 2703 of the First Era. To meet the foreign challenge, Reman had managed to unite the Clovian armies and the eastern armies of the Nibene Valley. His unification of once conflicting factions didn't end there. His reputation had been enough to establish him as the leading power in mainland Tamriel, and before his death, much of the continent was captured. By the year 2840 of the First Era, Reman II had gotten the whole of the mainland under imperial control with the exception of Morrowind. A war was waged between the Empire and Morrowind which lasted 80 long years. Reman II fell in battle after only 11 of those years. A truce was finally agreed to end the war in year 2920, but soon after, Reman III and his heir were assassinated on the orders of Reman's conniving chief advisor, Versidue Shay, ending the Reman dynasty as well as the First Era. Thus began the period of the Second Empire named the Akaviri Potentate. Instability returned to Cyrodiil, and the Akaviri Potentate faced opposition from Reman loyalists for close to 3 centuries. War had brought the empire to the brink of bankruptcy, and eventually Versidue was assassinated by the Morak Tong. His heir, Savrian Chorak, ruled for some time, until him and all his heirs were assassinated, finally ending the Second Empire. Now we reach the Interregnum, a period in which the Empire of Cyrodiil was only an empire in title. The reality was, this empire had only one permanent dependency, and that was Cyrodiil itself. During the same period of history, the first ALDMERI dominion was established. Queen Irene of the Ultima, unlike many of her peers, had actually left Somerset before. She had travelled Tamriel extensively, and she knew full well that Tamriel proper was in dire straits. The Bosmer and the Khajiit were in desperate needs of allies, and the High Elves planned to capitalize on this, proposing the Elden Accord and forming the Dominion. This is where the Alliance War comes into play. I won't stray too far into that rabbit hole, but as I said before, the Dominion's primary ambition was to claim Cyrodiil's Ruby Throne and the subsequent control over the mainland that would bring. The Dominion failed in this objective though, and the faction was dissolved. During this same interregnum period, the Empire of Cyrodiil was ruled over by a succession of pretenders, using conquest to take advantage of Cyrodiil at its weakest. In came the Longhouse Emperors, a dynasty of Richmond savages. Then came a Clovian king named Varan Aquilarios, the Duke of Coral, followed by his wife Clivia Tharn. What little remained of the Cyrodiilic Empire was toppling fast. The Alliance War waged on, pirates invaded the ports, aggressive expansion campaigns were launched and rapidly snuffed out. The Empire ceased to exist once more, until one legendary man came into the picture, a man named Tiber Septim. In the 854th year of the Second Era, the Third Empire was declared by Tiber Septim, and the Tiber Wars began. These wars were an ambitious, seemingly impossible series of conquests with the ultimate goal of reuniting the entirety of Tamriel under the Imperial banner once more. It lasted for decades, but one by one the provinces yielded to the Imperial might. In the beginning, Septim had been the general of the Clovian warlord Culucain's armies. Together they united the Clovian estates, forged an alliance with the Nords of Skyrim, and silenced the Reachmen of the west. Culucain was assassinated, and Tiber Septim was crowned the first ruler of the Septim dynasty. The remaining Nordic Jarls and Breton petty kings to resist Tiber Septim soon fell, and then imperial sights were set on Hammerfell. Infighting between the crowns and the forebears made the task much easier for the Imperials. Eventually Hammerfell was completely under the Empire's control. The Elven realms were the last to fall. While all this was going on, the Second ALDMERI Dominion had been formed. Complications in Valenwood caused by the Cameron dynasty had led some Bosmeri factions to seek the aid of the Imperials. This the High Elves would not tolerate, and they were forced into action. The Thalmor was founded as the new government of Valenwood. As with the last Dominion, the Khajiit were also brought on board, this time thanks to the Elsewhere Confederacy. On top of this alliance, the Ultima had recruited some Reachmen, and even their historic enemies, the Marama Sea Elves. Tiber Septim had pulled off the unimaginable, a feat not even Riemann was capable of achieving. He defeated the Dunmer of Morrowind, signing a peace treaty which skewed heavily in favour of the Imperials. Tiber Septim had no delusions of defeating the High Elves in naval warfare, but the Dunmeri peace offering might just be the tool he needed to win the war. The Numidium, the brass god, the gigantic Dwemer Golem. With this secret weapon, the Empire made short work of the previously impenetrable Somerset Isles. The whole of Tamriel was soon united after 44 years of war. The Empire reigned supreme. The Third Era commenced, and the Imperials enjoyed control over Tamriel for some time. Rulers came and went, succession wars were waged, but little changed for close to 2 centuries. Naturally, the Empire's power and control waxed and waned over the years, but the real dynamic shift came in at the end of the era, when the Oblivion crisis began. The mortal realm had been protected from Daedric invasion ever since Alicia's covenant with Akatosh, but when the Amulet of Kings was stolen, the dragonfires extinguished, and the Dragonborn bloodline seemingly ended, Tamriel was on the cusp of its undoing. The bastard heir to the imperial throne, Martin Septim, revealed himself, and his sacrifice ended the crisis, but the Empire was battered and broken. And there was no better time right now for the High Elves to form the third iteration of the ALDMERI Dominion. This time they wouldn't be dealing with Tiber Septim, and the Thalmor had cleverly taken credit for the end of the Daedric invasion, painting themselves as the saviors of Tamriel. The popularity of the Thalmor boomed, and they quickly seized control of the Isles. They also routed the Imperial influence out of Valenwood, and sometime later, during a phenomenon known as the Void Nights, the Thalmor claimed they were responsible for returning the 2 moons to the night sky when they disappeared. Knowing that the Khajiit had a particularly strong cultural bond to the moons, this claim would see the province of Elsewhere rejoin the ALDMERI Dominion. The Dominion was growing in strength while the Empire was licking its wounds. Even with some stability returned by the commencement of the Mede Dynasty, the High Elves were the favourites for the Great War. This is another area that I could cover in great detail, but for the sake of keeping this video under an hour, I'll summarise. The Thalmor planned to conquer the whole of Tamriel. It all began with a gruesome gesture, courtesy of an elven ambassador. He arrived at the Imperial City with a covered cart and an ultimatum for the Emperor. The list of demands was an insult, but the Dominion knew of the Empire's weakened state. The ultimatum was rejected, and the ambassador upended the cart, spilling over 100 heads on the floor. Every Blades agent in Somerset and Valenwood. The gift was not well received. Within days, the ALDMERI Dominion were invading Hammerfell and Cyrodiil simultaneously. Armies emerged from Valenwood and elsewhere to besiege the capital. The campaign in Hammerfell was a war of attrition, dragging on and on. But progress was made fast in Cyrodiil. The city was sacked, the palace burned, and the tower looted, but the Emperor had escaped to the north. The Battle of the Red Ring followed, and miraculously the forces of Cyrodiil, Skyrim, and Hammerfell reclaimed the Imperial city from the Dominion. Despite this incredible victory, the Empire were not faring well, and the White Gold Concordat was signed, officially bringing an end to the war. Outlawing Talos worship had provoked civil war in Skyrim, and the Empire abandoned Hammerfell, which led to them independently fighting on alone. The Empire is gravely wounded, and only High Rock and Cyrodiil remains under their total control as we approach the present day. If we were to ask the question, in the present day, Aldmeri Dominion versus the Imperial Empire, who would win? It would be pretty hard to properly discern who would actually win in an all-out Second Great War. There are really good arguments for both sides. However, what about the question, who would be the better ruler of Tamriel? The Aldmeri Dominion and the High Elves of Somerset in general have been very opportunistic over the years. They took advantage of their isolation to dodge the brunt of the mainland's problems, and they chose the best moments possible to leave their shores in pursuit of power and land. The First Dominion formed after the collapse of the Second Empire, when their two closest neighbours were in need of allies. The Second Dominion was formed out of necessity, but was quickly ended by an empire in its most prominent state. The third was a response to the Oblivion crisis, when the Empire was weak and heroic deeds could be falsely credited to the High Elves. Granted, the High Elves of Somerset were seasoned veterans in warfare, even if they were all defensive wars, and were it not for the Numidium's unnatural power, one could argue that Tiber Septim never would have conquered the Isles. But these variables do not change the reality that the Dominion does not have nearly as much experience ruling and governing as the Empire does. The Imperials understand conquest, but they also know from centuries upon centuries of experience how to rule during peacetime. The Empire has seen a great deal of corruption, betrayal, ambition, and all the vices one would expect of mortal hierarchies, but the Imperials have also, throughout their long history, managed to incorporate drastically different cultures, races, and societies into their empire. The histories of the Dominion and the Empire seem to mirror the qualities of the races who created them. The Dominion has had some success recruiting other provinces, but for the most part, their aims to conquer Tamriel have been based around asserting their supremacy, overpowering their foes rather than coexisting amicably with them. The High Elves themselves, well, their culture is built on racial purity. They view themselves as superior to all other races and have been historically xenophobic to outsiders. Unsurprisingly, these values do not translate well to leadership. Of course, were they to rule Tamriel, they would be superior to their vassal provinces, but cooperation is essential to a long-lasting reign, and revolution flourishes fast when rulers act more like oppressors than protectors. The Imperials make their status as rulers known with their banners and loyal liege lords, but they are also tolerant of other cultures, often allowing them to practice their own religions, customs, and worship their own gods. It's not hard to guess why the Thalmor outlawed Talos worship. For starters, he conquered their homelands, and secondly, doing so would certainly spark unrest in Imperial-controlled Skyrim. But do you think if the Dominion ruled Tamriel, the other provinces would take kindly to having their religions altered and legislated? The Imperials live in the center of the mainland. They're naturally involved in almost all the goings-on in Tamriel, and it shows through their racial qualities. Their culture is renowned for being the most cosmopolitan and diplomatic on the continent. They are natural peacekeepers, they're sociable and hospitable, and they are stereotypical diplomats and traders. It's in their blood. All of these factors seem to lead towards the Imperials being the better rulers of Tamriel. Of course, one could easily argue that the High Elves are objectively superior to the Imperials with their long lifespans, meticulously bred genetics, high intelligence, and gift for all things arcane. But until their society learns to quell their narcissism and look upon other races as equals, the Aldmeri Dominion simply will not be able to command the loyalty of Tamriel, not unless they achieve it through complete subjugation of the mainland population in ways similar to the Aelid's domination of Cyrodiil. The various iterations of the Empire have seen plenty of success and plenty of failure. It has ruled the whole continent and crumbled to ruin, but it has also risen from the ashes. The Imperials have faced worse odds than they now face in the 201st year of the 4th era, and I think if they can recover their strength, they are more fit to rule Tamriel. Living under the ALDMERI Dominion's rule would seem to default to a racially segregated and stratified society, with rebellion after revolution after insurrection, which essentially, ultimately, boils down to instability. And there you have it, guys, a long and complex topic, one of which I'm sure you all have your own opinions on. Voice them down below in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Who would be better to rule, the Empire or the Dominion? But thanks so much for watching this colossal beast of a video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, maybe give it a cheeky like. Once again, my name is Scott from FudgeMuppet, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again in the next one.